Tom Riddle, his first year in Hogwarts. Chapter 3, Bobby the House Elf. Abraxas, it turned out, was as starved for genuine connection as Tom was. Buried under the layers of pomp and ceremony, the endless parties and the expectations of his family, he was as lonely as Tom in his orphanage. His parents kept him distant from lesser company, drilling into him their beliefs of blood purity. He wasn't permitted to mingle with children of witches and wizards in his neighborhood. He was an heir, destined for greatness, and his interactions were carefully curated. They began spending more time together. They discussed everything: the lessons at Hogwarts, the other students, their ambitions, and their shared resentment for authority. Tom would listen as Abraxas complained about the pressure from his parents, the endless lectures on lineage and duty. Abraxas, in turn, was intrigued by Tom's past and the mystery of his origins. They were bound by their shared sense of isolation. One afternoon, during Transfiguration class taught by Dumbledore, Abraxas leaned over to Tom, a mischievous glint in his eyes. "Watch this," he whispered. They were learning to transfigure matches into needles. Tom knew that look. Abraxas, with a casual flick of his wand, subtly altered the needles, so they were invisible. And in the moments before the Hufflepuffs sat down for their lesson, he was discreetly placing the needles on their chairs. The lesson began, and the Hufflepuffs, unsuspecting, sat. The scream that followed was a symphony of shrieks and gasps as the students yelped in surprise. Dumbledore, ever calm, surveyed the chaos with a twinkle in his eye. He knew who was responsible, but did not intervene. Tom smirked, amused by the chaos. Dumbledore, after taking in the chaos and the mischievous grins of Tom and Abraxas, finally restored order with a wave of his hand. The invisible needles vanished, replaced by ordinary matchsticks. He did not chastise, did not even raise his voice. He simply restored the classroom and finished the lesson, then dismissed the class. As students began to gather their things, Dumbledore said, "Mr. Riddle, a word, if you please." Abraxas, already gathering his belongings, shot Tom a knowing glance. "I'll wait for you in the Great Hall," he said, his voice low. Tom nodded, heart rate quickening. He knew what was coming. The rest of the class filed out, their voices buzzing with excitement over the afternoon's event. Once they were alone, Tom tensed, anticipating the lecture. He began to justify their actions. "It was just a prank, sir. Nothing serious. No one was hurt." Dumbledore raised a hand, cutting him off in mid-sentence. "I am not quite referring to the incident with the needles, Mr. Riddle," he said. His blue eyes, as piercing as ever, were fixed on Tom. "Though perhaps we might discuss discretion at a later date." Tom steeled himself. Dumbledore's eyes were like a cool summer dawn, gentle but sharp. "Have you ever wondered about your origins, Tom?" He was silent, his gaze fixed on the polished floorboards. He knew his father was that muggle, the wealthy one from the village. That much he remembered from his mother's fragmented memories. He knew his father had abandoned them both. Dumbledore watched him, a patient, knowing look on his face. Tom didn't meet his eyes. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The silence in the classroom pressed in on him, heavy as a physical weight. Finally, Dumbledore spoke, his voice low and calm. "Now might be a good time to let you in on something, Tom, as you begin to understand the wizarding world. Hogwarts exists, in part, to help young witches and wizards, especially those who grew up as you did in the Muggle world." Tom still didn't speak. He knew he'd been different his whole life, and he liked that. He enjoyed being better than others and always wanted to prove himself. Dumbledore paused and continued. "Through my research, I'm aware of some of the details of your parentage. Your father, as you know, is a wealthy muggle. Am I correct, Tom?" Tom nodded, still staring at the floor. The room was growing warmer. Dumbledore continued. "Your mother, however, was from an old, once-renowned wizarding family." Tom remained silent, taking in this new information, his mind racing. He thought of his life in the orphanage, the strange moments when things seemed to happen without him willing it. His mother, if Dumbledore was to be believed, was a witch. He hadn't known, hadn't even suspected. He clenched his fists, the urge to question Dumbledore burning inside him. He lifted his head and finally asked, "Can you tell me more?" Dumbledore's face clouded over. He looked troubled, a rare expression for the professor. "Perhaps, Mr. Riddle," he said after a pause, "but not now. There are matters best left for a different time. He didn't elaborate. The uncertainty irked Tom. He pressed his lips into a thin line, the silence stretching between them. He felt like he was missing half of the story. Dumbledore continued, "What I can say now is that you should never be ashamed of where you come from, Mr. Riddle, whether wizard, muggle, or both. All that matters is the strength of your character and the choices you make." His gaze sharpened, focusing on Tom. "Be cautious, however, of the company you keep, especially now, at the start of your Hogwarts journey." Though he didn't name Abraxas, the implication was clear. Tom's mind latched onto that thought. Though he'd known Abraxas for only a short while, he understood the boy's ambition and his rigid adherence to tradition. The caution made him think. He decided to take it into consideration. Dumbledore finally stood, moving toward the door. "Do make your way to the Great Hall. I'm sure your friend is awaiting your return." He paused at the doorway and looked back at Tom, his blue eyes kind, yet probing. "I have faith, Mr. Riddle, that you will make wise decisions." And with that, he left the classroom, leaving Tom alone with his thoughts. Tom took his usual seat in the Great Hall, and Abraxas waited for him, a plate piled high with chicken wings. He sat down, the aroma of roasted chicken filling the air. "Ah, there you are," Abraxas said, his mouth already occupied. He wrestled with a wing, a look of comical frustration etched on his face. "These blasted things. Father would have a fit if I tried to eat this at home. No bones allowed. The elves would be mortified." Tom watched him, amused, as Abraxas gnawed at the meat with a focused intensity. "Dumbledore told me about my mother," Tom said. He kept his voice low, not wanting to attract undue attention. "Apparently, she was a witch." Abraxas paused mid-bite, his blue eyes widening in surprise. With some effort, he swallowed. "A witch? Well, that's certainly better than being a muggle-born," he said, then went back to attacking the wing. He seemed to have become a bit more relaxed toward Tom, dropping some of his usual aristocratic facade. "Thank Merlin. If you had Weasley hair and freckles, I would have been truly mortified to be seen with you." Tom, ignoring the jibe, said, "I want to know more." The words were flat, a demand veiled in polite conversation. He wouldn't tell me anything else, just cryptic hints and warnings. He wanted to know who his mother was, what kind of witch she had been, and whether any of her magic resided within him. Abraxas wiped his hands on a napkin, finally abandoning the wing. "Albus?" he said, a slight smile playing on his lips. "Albus is fond of playing these games. He enjoys the intrigue. Dangles the truth in front of you, but tells only half the story. It's his way of keeping things interesting, I suppose. Perhaps you should simply keep asking." The book, by Blood and Magic, an historical overview of influential wizarding families, sat open on Tom's desk. He flipped through the pages, the delicate parchment crackling softly. Abraxas had, of course, dismissed it as dull as a ministry memo on cauldron regulations. But Tom was fascinated. It wasn't just the genealogical charts that captivated him, but the glimpses into the lives and powers of those who came before. He was searching for any mention of his mother's family, anything that might shed light on his own origins. The common room was empty. Most students were either in the library or outside on the grounds, taking advantage of the afternoon sun. The silence was broken by a distant pop, which Tom initially ignored, assuming it was a particularly noisy spell demonstration. Then came a loud boom, followed by a series of odd gurgling sounds. It seemed the noise originated from the lavatories down the hall. He closed the book, his curiosity piqued. He found the corridor deserted. The echoes of the explosion still resonated in the air, a faint scent of burnt lavender hanging heavy. As he reached the men's lavatory, laughter echoed from within. He approached the door cautiously. He pushed the door open, and the sight that greeted him was, to say the least, unexpected. Bubbles, iridescent and suspiciously fragrant, were pouring out of every single toilet stall, overflowing onto the floor. The air was thick with the sweet scent of bubble bath. Standing amidst the bubbly chaos, mortified, was Bobby. The house elf looked up, his large eyes even wider than usual. His tea towel tunic was soaked, and a trail of bubbles clung to his small, pointed ears. "Oh dear," Bobby squeaked, wringing his hands. "Master Riddle, I was just trying to clean the lavatories, but the cleaning solution, it seems to have taken on a life of its own." Tom raised an eyebrow, trying to contain a smile. The scene was absurd. He gestured vaguely toward the overflowing stalls. A life of its own, you say? Bobby wrung his hands again, bubbles popping on his stubby fingers. Yes, Master Riddle, I am not very good at it. House elf magic, I mean. He gestured helplessly at the swirling, shimmering mess. I am sorry, Master Riddle. I will clean it up. Are you a Hogwarts house elf? Tom asked, trying to keep his tone neutral. He had never seen a house elf before, or at least not one he knew about. The stories he'd read mentioned them, but he had never seen one. Bobby blinked, his eyes widening further. He paused, then he blurted, No, Master Riddle, I'm with. He clamped a hand over his mouth, his face turning a shade of green that didn't quite match the bubbles. He looked stricken. Tom kept his expression blank, his mind already cataloging the information. So an elf in Hogwarts not employed by the school. Interesting. With whom? He pressed gently. Bobby began to tremble, flinching as if expecting a blow. I shouldn't have said that! Oh dear! Oh dear! Before Tom could offer any further response, Bobby grabbed a broom leaning against the wall and in a flurry of panicked energy, raised it above his head. He winced, then brought the broom down hard against his own backside, with a loud cracking sound. He winced again but clutched his tunic. I am a bad, bad elf, Bobby wailed, dropping the broom and bursting into tears. The commotion finally attracted the attention of someone other than Tom and Bobby. A girl with a cascade of dark hair appeared at the lavatory entrance. Even in the midst of the soapy chaos, she possessed an air of composure that was striking. Her eyes, dark and intelligent, assessed the situation in a single glance. She took in the gurgling toilets, the distressed house elf, and Tom's impassive expression. Her lips curved into a small, amused smile. Honestly, she said, her voice smooth and melodious, what a mess. She strode into the lavatory, her movements graceful despite the slippery floor. She flicked her wand and a swift Scourgify charm swept through the room. The bubbles vanished, leaving only damp tiles and the lingering scent of lavender. Bobby blinked, his tears still flowing, and stared at the vanished bubbles. That's better, isn't it? The girl turned to Tom. I'm Walburga Black, and you are. Tom, yes? We were in the same potions class this morning. Yes, Tom replied, his voice even. The Black family. Another ancient name, another thread in the tapestry of wizarding lineage. He tilted his head slightly, observing her. Thank you, he said, acknowledging the cleanup. Walburga turned to Bobby, her eyes narrowed, assessing. And you. Her gaze lingered on the elf's tea towel tunic. You're one of the Malfoys, aren't you? Bobby flinched, a fresh wave of terror washing over him. He was trembling again, his eyes darting between Tom and Walburga. Walburga grinned. Don't worry, little one. I won't tell Abraxas, not if you do something for me. She paused, letting her words hang in the air, allowing the tension to build. We're having a small gathering tonight, some friends. It would be a shame for a mishap to occur, wouldn't it? Tom glanced at the small brass clock on his bedside table. Midnight. Abraxas was asleep, muttering something about chicken wings, of all things. Tom suppressed a smirk, pulled on his black dress robes, and slipped out of the room, careful to make no noise. He moved through the shadowed dorm, a silent wraith, and reached the staircase leading down into the Slytherin common room. He paused at the top, peering cautiously over the railing. The common room was dimly lit by the green glow of the fireplace, and a small group of girls sat huddled together, their voices a low murmur. Walburga Black was among them, her dark hair gleaming in the firelight, her face animated as she spoke. In one shadowed corner, barely visible, Tom spotted Bobby. The house elf was pressed against the wall, fidgeting, his worried eyes wide and darting. Waiting his turn, apparently. A dark amusement flickered within Tom. He noted the scene, cataloging the players and their positions. He saw no obvious threats, no immediate need to intervene. Perhaps he would watch this play unfold, just to learn. Tom quietly descended the stairs, keeping to the edges of the room, out of sight. From his vantage point in the shadows, Tom watched as Walburga Black made a subtle gesture in Bobby's direction. The house elf, who had been trying to blend into the background, flinched at the attention. With a resigned sigh, he clicked his fingers, and immediately, bubbles began to pour from Pauline's mouth. The other girls in the common room erupted into fits of laughter, pointing at the struggling student. Pauline's cheeks bulged as she desperately tried to hold back the relentless stream of bubbles, her eyes wide with panic. Tom's expression darkened. He knew Pauline was a Muggle-born, and he could guess the reason behind Walburga's cruel prank. As the laughter grew louder, Tom considered his options. He could easily step forward and put an end to this humiliating display with a simple countercharm, but something held him back. A part of him, a cold and calculating part, was curious to see how this would play out. The bubbles continued to flow, enveloping Pauline in a shimmering soapy cocoon. Her struggles weakened, and she collapsed onto a nearby sofa, gasping for air between the relentless bursts. The other girls, including Walburga, only laughed harder, enjoying the spectacle they believed they had orchestrated. Suddenly, the bubbles ceased. The laughter in the common room died as quickly as it had begun. Pauline, sprawled on the sofa, coughed, blinking in confusion at the absence of her soapy torment. The other girls stared, their expressions shifting from amusement to bewilderment. Walburga Black, who had been leaning forward, a smirk playing on her lips, now straightened abruptly, a flicker of genuine surprise crossing her face. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for the source of the sudden cessation. Tom, hidden in the shadows, felt a familiar thrill course through him. He hadn't anticipated that. Bobby was gone. One moment he was there, a small, anxious figure cowering against the wall. The next, he was simply absent. In his place, a lingering scent of burnt ozone hung in the air, and a faint wisp of smoke curled upwards. Tom's mind raced, piecing together the fragments. The house elf had disappeared, obviously, but how? Why? And where? He decided his presence here was no longer conducive to gathering information. Tom turned away, moving with a newfound urgency. He slipped back into the shadows, the muted sounds of the common room fading behind him. He needed to get back to his room. He also wanted to be alone. He ascended the stairs, his footsteps soundless on the stone. He reached the door to his dorm room and paused, his hand hovering over the handle. The door was ajar. He hadn't left it that way. He pushed the door open wider. The room was empty and still. Abraxas was still asleep, silently. The next morning, the first rays of sun pierced through the narrow window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Tom and Abraxas were silently changing into their school robes. Tom deliberately avoided looking at his roommate, considering Abraxas's likely involvement in last night's events. It was clear Abraxas knew more than he let on. "Did you know Bobby was here?" Abraxas asked, his voice unexpectedly casual. He was fiddling with a silk tie, his expression unreadable. "I saw him," Tom replied, and continued to button his robes. His voice was carefully neutral. Abraxas chuckled, a short, dismissive sound. "Thought everyone was bringing a house elf to Hogwarts at first. Turns out, it's a bit of a risk with the new rules and all. Still, can't trust the school staff, can you? Bobby's helpful. When he's working right, anyway." He paused, then added with a touch of dry amusement. "Walburga Black, though, she's a different matter. Family's known for being a bit bonkers." Tom raised an eyebrow, feigning mild interest. "Bonkers how?" he inquired, turning back to him. Abraxas scoffed. "Oh, you know. Obsessed with dark arts, pure-blood nonsense, curses for breakfast. The usual. She wants to know everything. You understand?" "Did you stop the chaos last night?" Tom asked, his gaze fixed on Abraxas. He had to see exactly what was happening. Abraxas hesitated, smoothing down his robes, then turning to Tom. He looked amused. "One couldn't let a house elf get into trouble, could one? Especially not one that makes a better drink than the kitchen staff. That would be a shame." Satisfied with the implications in Abraxas's words, Tom finished adjusting his robes and turned towards the door. He did not show the surprise in his face.